webinar of the year. We'll be going through executing a year-end checklist in Acumatica. This will also be recorded and sent to you after the session as well. So for those of you, if it's your first time, just want to welcome you to this series. My colleagues, Tanya Kratzer, our Business Success Manager, John Rosine, our Solutions Consultant, and Maddie Clark, our Solutions Consultant as well, will be showing their screen and going through the content. Kind of want to walk you through the agenda first. So really quick, the first thing we'll be going through is our frequently asked questions. So John will take you through features including what the financial period status looks like, just basically the questions that we get as related to a year-end close that are pretty common. So he'll take you through those. Then we'll get into, Maddie will present what's in Acumatica as our business scenarios, and that's a nice way to store and execute a checklist or a work instruction within Acumatica. So we'll show you what that looks like. And then we'll go through some basic features of how to streamline some core recurring entries in Acumatica that you may have maybe forgotten about, or maybe you're learning about them for the first time today. So thank you for joining us. We'll end the session today with actually a little poll, a vote for the content of the next webinar. Because January is a pretty busy month for everyone, we're actually going to skip the January webinar and get into February. So look for an invite after this session for the February invite as well. And with that, I think the other thing is, please, if you have questions as we go, please do ask them. Tanya will be reviewing all the questions as they appear in the chat, and she will pipe up and voice them if needed. So we also have a Q&A at the end as well. So it's your preference if you want to submit it during the session or after. All right, and with that, I'm going to hand it over to John.
All right, thanks, Andrea. So I'll go ahead and proceed into our frequently asked questions here. And really, this is going to set the stage for Maddie, who's going to go through our year-end checklist as it's set up in Acumatica. But I think before we dive into that, it's important to address some of the questions that we typically get around this time. And you can see here, as we go through these, they might be some things that are addressed on a monthly basis. For instance, this first item here on period management, typically addressed on a month-to-month basis, right, with opening and closing periods. But we want to kind of walk through some maybe nuances with the year-end process, kind of as an extension of those monthly processes. So first, with the period management, I'll go ahead and share my screen here with Acumatica up. So I'll be in our demo environment. And we'll start here with our master financial calendar. And so as I navigate into our calendar here, again, typically a screen here that you address on a monthly basis. So you're closing a month and opening the next month. But what can sometimes happen is at this point too, at year end, if there's different individuals involved, understanding that there's a security role behind this. So our financial supervisor role in Acumatica is not only available to allow individuals to post to close periods, but also to manage the financial periods as well. So what we'll see here, if I go into close periods, for instance, let's say I'm closing a few periods here, my options for processing along this action menu are going to be driven towards that financial supervisor role. So if I just bring up a user screen real quick. And I'm going to I'll bring up my account here. If we take a scroll through our roles, you'll see a number of roles here in the demo environment, but this financial supervisor role, out of the box role provided to Acumatica, that's rarely linked to any custom roles that might be developed for your team, is a critical role to make sure that that functionality is available. So one thing that we want to highlight in regards to that, if you're having any issues with any new personnel in the year-end process, not being able to manage those periods successfully. And then also too, as a reminder, as you're going through, you might encounter certain issues with unposted transactions. So for instance, if I run this process here to close this period, and as of right now, I'm running this through the GL module, you'll see those checks for the other ledgers. You'll see this error indicated here. And if I look at this, I see that there's something related to our AR module. And to me, that says that there's some sort of an unposted transaction. Well, Acumatica does a good job with queuing that in our unposted documents. So if I select that directly from that financial period screen, you'll be directed into a report of unreleased documents. For our particular case here, this is AR. So this is isolated to our AR module. And you can jump into that invoice and you can see what might have caused that particular invoice in this case to be on hold. And we can see that there is a credit issue. So that would need to be resolved before closing your AR and subsequently your GL module. And so additionally, what we might address as well, something that isn't typically part of the month process, but would be progressing from closed to a locked status. So what that does is it's our status beyond close. So let's say we close out our financial year. We can actually move into our lock selection for our financial periods. And what that does is it prevents even a financial supervisor from posting to a closed period because now it's under that lock state. So typically what we see at the end of the year, your adjusting entries are in, you worked with your auditing team if that's part of your process, those adjusting entries are in, financials have been signed off on. You can take that last step to close these periods more permanently through the lock action. And so with that, you can go ahead, lock each one of those financial periods. And once that's complete, again, that provides a more permanent close for those months. And of course, let's say there was an auditing adjustment that was missed or that came up later, you can always unlock it, revert it back to its closed status, post, and then relock it if necessary. So it isn't a permanent status on those periods. You can always revert it back. So additionally, on the year-end process, largely what comes up is our 1099 vendor reporting. So I'll go through just a few key factors that come into play for our 1099 vendors. And so if I look at, let's go into our payables module here, and I'll navigate into my vendor list. I made it relatively easy on myself with the vendor name. I'm just going to do a contains 1099 to bring up my 1099 vendor here, project 1099. I'll go ahead and select that vendor record. So a few things that come up initially for our 1099 vendors, first and foremost, is making sure that they're actually designated as a 1099 vendor when set up. So if we look in our general tab, as you might be aware already, we have our vendor properties here, our 1099 designation, and then we have a 1099 box default. And so again, this is a default that is carried over onto the line detail of your AP bill or your transactions. And that is one thing that can be updated after the fact, after it's released and posted. You can actually go back in Acumatica and change that. So if something is inappropriately keyed in this particular case to that box 7, let's say it should be a box 14 item instead, you can actually update that 1099 box. And I'll bring that up in a quick example as well, so we can see what that 1099 designation looks like. And then also too, under the purchase settings, depending on your version of Acumatica, this has moved around a little bit, but we would have that tax registration ID that would need to be populated as well for our 1099 reporting. And we also now have a designation of the type of tax ID that is. So if it's your EIN, Social Security, and so on, you can make that designation. Also too, real quick, if you look into your preferences as well, you'll see our 1099 minimum thresholds. So these should be in line with the IRS, but you can also have these updated here. But you can see, for instance, box 7, that minimum is $600 for a 1099 report to be generated. So as you might expect, if you go into print your 1099, vendor only has $500. Because it doesn't reach that threshold, it will not appear in your printed report. So those are available underneath your AP preferences and those 1099 settings. And then also too, if you are in the first year of your implementation, I do want to make a quick note that as you're going through the 1099 preparation process, to ensure that if it was required, that 1099 balances were migrated in, right? So in Acumatica, when you're transacting, those transactions from that point forward are recorded under your 1099 vendor. But if there were balances that preceded that weren't properly migrated into Acumatica or are still on the to-do list, ensure that you get those in so that you have the proper tie-outs at year end. And that's something that we can assist with. We typically use our migration mode to ensure that that data exists without impacting your GL with duplicative data. So once you have the configuration in place, you have any migrated balances if you're in that first year of implementation, and you are appropriately tagging your transactions. You have a few forms available to you to assist with 1099 view. And so underneath our 1099 reporting, Acumatica does like to keep it all consolidated for you. We have our 1099 vendor history, our 1099 year summary, 1099 year details. So I won't go through each one of these, but one that I think would probably be the most valuable for tagging transactions is using this 1099 year details report. So if I click into this, you default based off the branch that you're logged into. So I'm in products wholesale. We see that here that can be adjusted. I won't go ahead and do that because I know where the 1099 data exists in the system here. So I'm staying in this branch. But we have our 1099 year, and I'll go ahead and select this for 2020. And let me run that report. You can see my project 1099 vendor up here and any bills that are associated with that particular year and that vendor. So this is a good way if you're unsure. Let's say you're doing an overview of the 1099 and at the summary level, and you see that there should be something stated under box 14, for instance, on this vendor. I can see which bills are appropriately applied against 7. And if something stands out here, I can log into that bill or I can venture over to that bill and correct it. So I'm just going to take this number here and I'm going to drop into my bills and adjustments screen as an example. And out of the box on this 1099 detail report, we don't have drill down, but that is something that could be added if necessary. Otherwise, you can just do a simple filter. So I'm on my bills and adjustments screen. I filtered under this reference number. And in this transaction here, you'll see off to the right-hand side, our 1099 box. And you'll see that this is actually available, even though it's closed. You can see that I can update it. So I can move this to, let's say, box 14 if necessary. And I can go ahead and save that document. And then when I refresh my report here, you can see now that I have a box 7 and a box 14 associated with that vendor. So this report I do like to show just because it is very easy to identify any transactions that might need to be recoded. Because again, that vendor setting, that default box, drives all the detail for those transactions moving forward. All right. And so with that, we have also our 1099 miscellaneous and 1099 NEC forms. So this will populate based off of the settings. As we know, with 1099 reporting, we have that separate NEC form based off of box 7. So this will run only for our vendors that have activity there. Same thing on the miscellaneous. It'll be for all those except for box 7, as it's now captured in NEC. So if I run this report, you would see the IRS standard reports. Again, you can print this to the IRS blank stock, and that can be used for your reporting purposes. And you can see here my 1099, my project 1099, again, designated for easy tracking here in the demonstration. We can see that that's been reported for NEC. And then we also have an extension too of our e-filing. So I'll do a quick demonstration on this, very similar to actually printing the physical forms. It has automated filtering for those NEC and those miscellaneous vendors. And so if I run this for, let's see here, let me grab my 1099 year first. You'll see the vendors that are available within that 1099 year. And based off of what you select here, miscellaneous or NEC, it will print similar to our reports that preceded this. It'll only print the NEC documentation for those vendors that meet the requirements. Same with the miscellaneous. So you don't have to worry about filtering. You can just process them as is. So if I select this and let me go ahead and process this for our NEC, we'll actually see Acumatica generates a flat file that will meet the IRS specifications and can be uploaded directly for e-file purposes to the IRS. So a few helpful tools there as you think about that 1099 you're importing. Of course, if you have any questions on that, feel free to reach out. But we have additionally here a few things that kind of support the 1099 vendors and other areas of Acumatica. And that's number 3 here, ensuring that you go through any software updates that are required. So upgrading to the latest build to ensure that your IRS reporting is up to speed. And that is supported on the versions, I believe it's 3 versions back, Tanya. You might have to correct me on that. But the supported versions will have the updated builds that support any new 1099 information. Additionally, we have a few extra steps here that can be helpful. As a part of your year-end cleanup process, we do recommend going through and inactivating GL accounts, vendor accounts, customer accounts across the board that are no longer applicable. Usually what we see in our implementation process is we do that from a historical system, but sometimes that can be forgotten now that you're on a new system. So just a reminder to the best of your ability to keep going through that master data to keep your system clean and ensuring that there's no incorrect coding to GL accounts or customers moving forward. So just a general inactive cleanup process there. And then for number 5, we've had requests around granting additional access for audit purposes. So one of the nice things about the Acumatica license, aside from the small business model, is to ensure that users can be brought in and there isn't an additional fee associated with that. So we can grant access, for instance, view only for audit purposes. Now, I come from an audit background, so I would suggest that you do a detailed analysis of those permissions to ensure that that view only access is only granted for areas that audit is required. You know, if that's your financial statements review, wherever that exists in the system, you can expose a view only access role or set of roles for an audit team if that's necessary. And then auto reverse accruals. One thing that is required for those auto reversing entries is to ensure that the next period for any accruals, let's say we're posting in December and we have an automatic reversal in January, do need to make sure that that January period is open. Otherwise, you will get an unposted error. And so if I take a quick look in Acumatica under our finance GL preferences, we'll actually see here that we have under our generate reversing entry, we can actually generate those auto reversing entries either on post or on period closing. So be aware that if you have the on period closing, be aware that those transactions might try to produce for that next period at that point. And if it's not open, you will get that, that transaction error. So just being aware of that, open that period for additional accrual entries. All right. So again, all of these are frequently asked questions that we receive. Maddie will actually take over from here to dive into the scenario checklist that can help support this year-end process.
All right, thank you, John. So the next item on our list, can everyone see the agenda PowerPoint? I want to make sure I shared the right screen here. All right. The next item on our list is going to be business scenarios and tasks. So for a lot of what John covered, talking about 1099s, closing out calendar years, making sure you have that audit ready to go. All of those are part of a workflow. And for, one thing that we know, particularly this year, that's kind of hit the business world by storm is a lot of hiring and onboarding. So for many of you who are old hat with a lot of the processes that John went through and would know those like the back of your hand, one thing that might come in handy is standardizing that workflow with some documentation and task building in Acumatica that kind of helps support your team with a workflow. And one great way to do that is functionality called scenarios, which we're going to be going through today. So here's our Acumatica. Just for housekeeping, I'll be showing you two different screens with the scenarios workflow, both of which are in the configuration module. You might not have that configuration module pinned by default. So you might have to find that configuration module under more items here and just go ahead and pin that first. The two screens we're going to be working with are scenarios and recurring scenarios. So to start, scenarios is where you're going to build your scenario. So I'll go to my tab here. Here I have my end of year workflow task built out. Now, a lot of these you'll recognize actually from items that John went through. So this just talks about how to update your 1099s. This one goes through calendar management, final posting. Those are your auto reversing postings there. Validate module balances. Make sure that you've reviewed your statement, software upgrade, right? So all of these are part of your workflow. And you can see what I have here are subtasks as well. So if you open up accrual entries, you can see that I have payroll, interest accruals, depreciation, depending on what modules you're using. And on the right here, I have explanations. So for example, when you're making those payroll accruals, does it make sense to use a template? So here I've just simply screenshotted a quick template option. Just that might be really helpful for someone, creating some of those payroll entries for the first time this year, highlighting that auto reversing option, for example. So this is what an auto reversing entry looks like. And you can add some color commentary as well and go through steps. And this is an example of statements as well. So I've just screenshotted, the title of the statements, how to validate modules. So I go through, what reports to hit here and then outline some steps as well. So this is kind of what a workflow looks like. And if I pop these open, you can see that each of these have subtasks as well. And a lot of these are going to be in line with what John went through in terms of inactivating profiles and everything like that. So this is what a workflow checklist does. Now, at the end of the day, what you're going to see is we'll do the setup of this, and I'll kind of demonstrate how to do that setup, but you'll actually see tasks generated out of this. So you can assign tasks to an individual person. That person has ownership over, say, reviewing vendors, making sure there's nothing that's really old out there, right? And that allows you to assign ownership and generate tasks based on that. So to start, we're going to go back to scenarios here. So let's create a scenario from the ground up. If we hit this plus button here, let's call this end of year checklist. I'm going to say dash my initials here. If you're not sure, grab administrator for the rule name. This might be your financial clerk, your key finance manager. Any custom roles you have there might be appropriate. And then we're going to select our workspace. So at the end of the day, this is where your checklist is going to show up in your workspace here. And I'll show you what that looks like when we get this started as well. Typically, an end of year checklist would be in finance. If it's AP specific, you might put it in payables. If it's AR specific, you might put it in the receivables module. So we'll go ahead and save this. And now we're going to build our checklist. So if we go into this checklist here, I'm going to refresh my screen just to make sure everything's good. What we're going to do is populate a simple two-step workflow. So I'm going to add a task here. And we're going to call this validate AP balances against GL. So one key end of year process that you may include or have included in the past is just making sure that all of those AP specific balances, so AP age period sensitive, matches up against those AP balanced GLs. So that's going to be a two-step process for us. If I hit the plus button again, what that's going to generate for me is a subtask. So now, similar to the workflow that we were just looking at, you can have multiple tasks underneath an entire workflow here. So this is our new task. I'm going to call this AP validate AP open balances and save. And then we're going to create our second task here. And we're going to call this reconcile AP to GL. All right. There's a couple of functionality pieces to take advantage of here. The first is this detail section. So basically, the sky's the limit here. You can do some formatting here. I'll give you two examples of things that we've seen before. I have some HTML here to pull in. So this is just a simple HTML format I've used really often on, notifications and business templates. If you want a copy of it, go ahead and reach out. But basically all this is just some simple formatting. This has some content, it's walking the user through what to check, check this report, and then I've added a link here. So if you click on this, you can edit the link. And then all I've done here is I grabbed the URL link for APH period sensitive, which is the report that we want to link in this step. And then I've said view report here. So that's the title. So go ahead and cancel out of that. So again, the details section is what the person's going to pick up when they're assigned the task. Another important thing is, who do you want to assign this to? So I'm actually going to assign the first task to myself. And we'll save. Under screen details, you can specify an individual report. In our case, we want to view AP aged period sensitive here. So I'll search that and save. Let's see. So an example of predecessors and successors, this allows you to assign an order that the workflow should be completed. So in our particular case, it makes the most sense to reconcile AP to GL after you've validated those AP open balances. So that might actually have an order. So that's an example where I could use the predecessors tab here, and I could say, okay, before you complete AP to GL, that step, make sure that you are completing this step first. So that's our predecessor. And this works both directions. If we pull open this other one here, you can actually see that the other has been listed as a successor. So on reconcile AP to GL here, we're going to pull open some instructions here. And let's say we just have some information here. This gives the user instructions on, how to pull the report, what periods to pull the report for, and it looks like my image didn't come over. So I'll give that one more try. There we go. So this is actually highlighted. This is highlighting where the user should go, how to access that. It's in the payables module as well. So go ahead and save this. And actually, before we move on, I want to actually assign this to someone as well. I'm going to assign this to our Maxwell Baker user. All right. Once you're finished with the workflow, you have everything adjusted. The final step is to activate the scenario. So the scenario was pending. Now it's in progress. We're ready to create a schedule. All right. So recurring scenarios, that's going to be in your configuration option. This is how you assign your task workflow to a schedule. Now, what you want to probably do is have this generate once per month. You might say, beginning of financial period, there's a lot of options here. I'm going to select daily just for demonstration purposes. Likely what you do with your checklist is actually just generate the tasks, monthly or by financial period. So less often, but I'm going to go for daily again, just so that we can get this generated while we're looking at it today. And then here's my checklist. So I'm going to save this. And if I hit run now, what that's going to do is generate the task that we just created. So we got 2 steps, one for me, one for Maxwell Baker. Let's take a look at where that generated. So if you remember, back when we were setting up our scenario, we put this in the finance menu. So under processes here, you can actually see this end of your checklist -MC. So that's what we just created. Now we're kind of transitioning from the setup part to actually the user part. So we're transitioning, now I'm the user actually accepting these tasks. And this is kind of workflow-wise what it would look like for me to complete these tasks. So if I click on this here, here's my checklist. So we've got 3 items. These are our 2 tasks. And then under my tasks, I can see that one of those 2 items has been assigned to me. From here, what I would do is click on these tasks. So I'm going to validate AP open balances. This is the detail section that we put in. I've got a nice link to that report, some instructions. I know what should have happened first. So the successors tab is telling me, hey, this should be completed beforehand. And I can start this task. Once I start this task, it's got a timestamp when it was begun. That's helpful just for communicating to your team that someone's working on it. Then I can mark as completed. Then there's some ownership. It's got a timestamp. It's got my name. And from a management perspective, when there's a lot of items going through the team, you'd be able to see, who completed what. Additionally, you can hit go to screen here. So this is going to take us to our AP age period sensitive. So back when we were setting up our checklist, when we put in that screen, that's what creates this. So that's what our end of year checklist looks like. And just to show you one other example, I took you to our reconcile AP to GL. Let's see what that one looks like. So this one had the screenshot. This one looks a little bit different. It's got a little bit more instruction here as well. And we can mark this as completed. So it's got the same workflow. All right. So business scenarios and tasks. So kind of to summarize, really helpful tool, especially with onboarding. We've seen clients use that tool in a variety of ways. We've even seen like a wiki application where maybe it's less of a workflow and more of pointers, right? You don't necessarily have to use a template to create your transaction. But if you have a couple screenshots and can share that as a team, maybe that's the easiest way to complete, that task for the month. What are kind of shortcuts and nice workflow elements that have helped other folks? And you can maybe have multiple contributors as well. As we kind of talk about end of year, another thing that we discuss as a team is, how do you enhance your monthly processes? So we talk about recurring transactions or templating. What are types of transactions that happen, on a periodic basis that you could be utilizing some Acumatica functionality? So to start, we'll talk about a recurring transaction. So to do that, we'll go to Journal Transactions. We'll create a new transaction. So in this scenario, we'll call this a payroll transaction. This is end of month. Because we're talking about end of year, I'm going to actually make this auto reversing. So what we want to do is record that we owe wages payable, but we want that to auto reverse at the beginning of next month so that we can record the liability in this financial period, which is important. So there's a couple things we're going to do here. Our transaction date is going to be the 31st. Because we're putting in this transaction at the very end of a period, and we're going to make this an auto-reversing transaction as well. We'll add a quick description. One really underutilized tool within Acumatica is this upload feature. So load records from file. I'll kind of show you what this looks like. All I have just in preparation for this demo is a quick Excel spreadsheet populated with some accounts, values, debits, and credits. And we're going to plug this into Acumatica, and you can see how that works. So I'm going to choose the file here. This is just my file finder. Go ahead and find our webinar here. And here's my journal transaction. And we'll upload. Before we get to this section, I want to show you what my Excel spreadsheet looks like. All right, so this is what I have prepared. I cheated a bit and I created this first in Acumatica and then exported, but the idea is the same. Basically what you want is just one column header that labels what the values are. So for example, this is accounts, this is your transaction date, debits and credits, so that basics. You don't have to have everything. You can always add information once you get to Acumatica as well. So this is what I have prepared. I'm going to say OK. Now this is where you line up what you have in your spreadsheet versus Acumatica. So on the left here, you'll see this is what my spreadsheet says. So I have account number, and then when I double click here, what I'm going to do is select the Acumatica value. So this is slightly different. What we want this to connect to is account. Same with our transaction description. So go ahead and select this. Our debits and credits. And our project. We'll say OK. All right. So what you should see here is exactly what I have on my Excel. So all these values, we've got the 80,000 and all these values here. Our accounts have come over properly, branches as well. And I've now quickly pulled up a monthly payroll accrual. Go ahead and save this. So that's an example of an Excel upload. This might also honestly be a really good application of the template function as well. So if you want to hit this clipboard here, you can say save as template. And then we'll call this MC. And what this does is if I were to create another transaction, what I could do is grab this clipboard and paste from a template. So that's another good option for transactions that you make frequently. Now, as far as recurring transactions, we might hold that for our next webinar. So look forward to that. But in summary, I hope some of the things you've gained, in terms of things to think about at the end of the year. So we had John go through inactivating, old accounts, talking about 1099s. What kinds of due diligence processes are you thinking about? I hope you were considering scenarios. If you want to use that for onboarding, for even just giving nice tips and tricks, sharing those among your team, working with some task workflow. And finally, kind of as we look to the new year, I hope you're considering some of that more advanced functionality, especially if you've been live with Acumatica for a year or more and are now feeling more comfortable creating some of those recurring transactions or exploring a transaction template. Okay. So with that, I will get to the right slide and I will turn it over to Andrea.
Okay. Thank you for attending. As I mentioned, we're going to skip actually the January webinar because January is a pretty busy month for folks. But wanted to hear your feedback on options for the next webinar. So our thoughts are basic dashboards, right? So how to build and adjust dashboards based on generic inquiries, approval routings and workflows, so how to use assignment and approval maps. And we can also kind of go through those notifications as well to alert folks that they have a transaction to approve in their queue. And then security and auditing. So probably a lesser known feature as well in terms of the audit trail that you can set up with Acumatica and the unique ways that you can form the security roles. So everyone you should be able to see the poll on your screen. So I just want to ask folks to vote for your preference for the next February webinar. And we'll kind of take that feedback. Oh, I see a topic too. How about financial statements? So yeah, we could certainly do a financial statement webinar at some point as well. Go through the basics of row and column set definitions and unit stuff. That's good to hear. Okay. Okay, so it looks like we have a winner for basic dashboards. Okay, that's great. So we will send out the February dates for the webinar, and it'll obviously include the basic dashboard component. We can send out some other information beforehand too, so you can review some information that's out there. Okay. All right. And in closing, Matt, if you want to advance to the next slide, there you go. So if you have any questions about the topics or how to execute some of the features that Maddie and John showed today, please don't hesitate to email us either directly or to the technical support email queue, and just put webinar in the title so our queue knows how to route those questions. I think other than that, we are about at time. Thank you so much for attending. Really appreciate your participation. And I think our BD team will also send out a survey as well. So if you have any feedback for our team, whether the content or the presentation, please let us know, as we'll be doing a lot more of these next year. All right. Well, thank you for your time and have a great holiday and New Year. Thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.